This is Unit 2.1, working on solving absolute value equations. The first thing we're going to look at is actually just practicing splitting the equation. So this is a skill building activity that we did in class. When we have an absolute value, there are two solutions to the equation, and so what we practiced was taking the absolute value of x, so we take the term that's on the inside and we're going to set it equal to the number that's on the outside, and then we're going to take the term on the inside of the absolute value and set it equal to the opposite, or the negative value of the inside. And again, that's because if we were to plug in the absolute value of 34 equals 34, and the absolute value of negative 34, which is the distance of negative 34 from 0, is actually 34 steps. So the absolute value of negative 34 is positive 34. So there will be two answers to all of these. So we're practicing splitting them. We would then take k is equal to 3, and k is equal to negative 3. N is equal to 9, and n is equal to negative 9. Continuing on, k is equal to 43, and k is equal to negative 43. So there are two values that our variable could be when we're dealing with absolute values. So n is equal to 12, because 12 is 12 steps away, and n is equal to negative 12, because negative 12 is also 12 steps away from 0. I'm not going to spend much time going over these because they're all the same. In continuing to practice splitting the equation, we now have an expression on the inside of n plus 8. We're going to do the same thing, split the equation so that n plus 8, the stuff on the inside, is equal to 7, and n plus 8 is equal to the opposite value, negative 7. And again, this is a skill building activity. A little later in the video, we'll actually solve a couple of these. We're going to take x plus 8 and set it equal to 10. We will also have x plus 8 and set it equal to negative 10. We are what I call splitting the equation. So we're going to split this with the absolute value bars, split it to negative 4x equals 20, and negative 4x equals negative 20. So we split the equations. Do a couple more. The inside equals the same. The inside equals the opposite. Even when we have two-step equations on the inside, it's the same idea. The inside, 2x minus 6, equals the same, and the inside, 2x minus 6, equals the opposite, negative 2. Do one last one here, 39. So the inside value equals the same, and the inside equals the opposite. Okay, so now we're going to do 2.1 solving one-step absolute value equations. And I'm just going to work through the odds on this. On the front page, we're dealing with addition and subtraction, and then on the back side, we are dealing with multiplication and division. So the first thing we need to do is split the equation just like we practiced. V minus 1 equals 7. V minus 1 equals negative 7. Now we've created two equations that we can solve. One here in red and one here in yellow. So when I'm solving my first equation, just as we did in Unit 1, what are we trying to get by itself? V. What needs to move? The negative 1. How do we move it? We're going to do the opposite operation. We're going to add it to both sides so that V is equal to 7 plus 1, which makes 8. My second equation, we can't just write negative 8, and we'll see why in just a moment. We need to get V by itself, which means we add 1 to both sides. V equals, these cancel out, negative 7 plus 1, our signs are different. We subtract and keep the sign of the larger number. So 7 minus 1 is 6, and our larger number was negative, so that is negative 6. And those are our two answers. So the idea behind the splitting equations worksheet is that absolute values always have two answers, which means we need to learn how to create two problems. Here, we're working on creating two problems and then actually finding the answers. So in number 3, we have an absolute value, which means there needs to be two problems. We're going to make V minus 10 equal to 17 and V minus 10 equal to negative 17. Now that we have two equations, I'm just going to solve my first equation by adding 10 to both sides, so that V is equal to 17 plus 10, which does make 27. And then I'll move on to my second equation, where we add 10 to both sides, so that V is equal to negative 17, positive 10. Our signs are different. We subtract and keep the sign of the larger number, negative 7. Again, with an absolute value, we split, so 6 plus m is equal to 2. 6 plus m is equal to negative 2. Then we just solve each equation. In our first one, we subtract 6 from both sides so that m is equal to, our signs are different. We subtract, keep the sign of the larger number, negative 4. In our second equation, we subtract 6 from both sides. Signs are the same. We add them and keep the sign. In number 7, again we split our equation. B plus 10 equals 14. B plus 10 equals negative 14. We now just solve each equation separately. To get B by itself, we need to move the 10. We move it by doing the opposite operation. It was adding, we will subtract. So that B is equal to 14 minus 10, which gives us 4. In our second equation, we'll subtract 10 from both sides, so that B is equal to, signs are the same, add them and keep the sign, negative 24. Okay, we're going to follow the same steps here, even though now we have terms that are going to be multiplying and dividing. It's an absolute value. We've got to split it into two equations. N divided by 7 equals 2. N divided by 7 equals negative 2. In order to get n by itself, we need to move the 7. I'm going to focus on this first equation here, and then I'll move on to the second equation. So n is being divided by 7. We undo division with multiplication. So I'm going to multiply 7 to both sides. Those n's will cancel out to get, those 7's will cancel out to give us 1n equals 2 times 7, which is 14. Likewise, the second equation, we're going to multiply 7 to both sides so that these cancel out to give us n is equal to negative 14. Number 11, the absolute value of negative 8n is equal to 64. We split our absolute value so that negative 8n equals 64 and negative 8n equals negative 64. Focusing on the first equation, negative 8 is multiplying with n, so we are going to divide negative 8 to both sides in order to get n by itself, and we find that 64 divided by negative 8 is negative 8. In our second equation, we do the same thing. We're going to divide negative 8 from both sides. These will cancel out so that n is equal to positive 8. Okay, the last couple here. Still need to split this, so b divided by 2 equals 3. b divided by 2 equals negative 3. In order to get b by itself, we need to move the 2. We multiply it to both sides so that b is equal to 3 times 2, which does make 6. In my second equation, we still need to multiply 2 to both sides. Which is going to leave us with b equals negative 6. Okay, absolute value means we need to split it. I like to pretend like I'm using this bar to create that split, and I'm using this bar to create this split. It's not really mathematical, but it's kind of a mental way of reminding myself that when I have a bar, the absolute value bar, I need to split it. That way I don't write it back in when I rewrite my equation. So 10b equals negative 40. We need to get b by itself. It's multiplying with 10. We undo multiplication with division. So I'm going to divide 10 to both sides so that b is equal to 4. In my second equation, I divide 10 from both sides to find that b is equal to negative 4. And that's the end of that. So one thing that we'll notice is that when we were just adding and subtracting, we would end up with 2 different answers, entirely different numbers. And then when we were just doing one step with multiplying and dividing, they ended up being the inverse of each other. Negative 8, positive 14, negative 14, so on. Okay, and so that is lesson 2.1. We practice splitting the equation and then